Okay, guys, welcome back to History 1302. Today we're going to be doing the second part of Reconstruction. And so for today, we are going to be going over the political battle for Reconstruction. Last time we talked about, what, defining freedom actually meant, what challenges former slaves were faced with. In light of, slavery being abolished, what kind of implications, right, consequences of that freedom meant for those communities in the South, for labor, sharecropping, black codes, all of those things, that the way not only that former slaves reacted, but also white Southerners as well. Today, though, we are going to be focusing on the political battle for Reconstruction. And so, of course, what this means is how does the government incorporate, how do they bring back the states that seceded, leading into the war, and then now that the war is over, how do they bring them back? Because remember, they seceded from the nation, they drew up new constitutions, but they lost the war. And so part of the process of Reconstruction is not just the literal, rebuilding of these communities, and society, which is what the focus was on in the first part of the lecture, but now the legal and the government reconstruction moving forward. So let's begin with Abraham Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, right? This is his presidential plan in 1863. What he wanted to do, obviously, this is still, in the middle of the Civil War. The war is not over yet. So he wanted to come up with a plan to bring back the states, to restore them. One of the things about Lincoln is that he never really wanted to accept that the southern states had seceded. To him, they were in rebellion. And so he wanted to come up with an easy, pragmatic way of ending the war and bringing back these states, right? Restoring them. And so his plan for Reconstruction is known as the 10% plan. Because he was trying to get, 10% of the population, the voting population in those states, to say, okay, we want to end this war. We want to be restored to the Union. And the way that he looked at it was, 10% is doable. We can do that, right? Surely there must be 10% of the people in those states that want to end this and want to, just resume life as it was before, or as close to as it was before. And so again, he's doing this because he is trying to find an easy, pragmatic, practical way of doing this. However, radical Republicans did not like his plan because they thought it wasn't strict enough on these southern states. And so he wants this 10% plan, but Congress is going to essentially answer him back by passing the Wade-Davis bill, which is asking for a 50% Reconstruction plan. So they want 50% of the population to, recognize the U.S. Constitution. They want stronger safeguards, to protect former slaves. They want a plan that is going to protect the freedom of blacks, of former slaves. So they don't think that Lincoln's 10% plan goes far enough. And so, they passed the Wade-Davis bill, but Lincoln doesn't sign it. In other words, he pocket vetoes the bill. Now, when Lincoln does this, he's essentially telling them, look, we can't do 50%. That's too difficult to do. Continue working on this, right? Give me something I can sign. And as you know, even though Congress can pass these laws, they still need the president to sign it to become, to execute them, right? To go into effect. But it doesn't. So he pocket vetoes neither his Reconstruction plan nor the Wade Davis bill moves forward, and the war keeps raging on. Okay, now we know what happens at the end of the Civil War. Lincoln, of course, loses his life, and this is going to be a problem. This is going to be a problem because for radical Republicans, let's talk about who they are, because one of the things that, we need to explain here is all of these people are Republicans, right? They all want to end the war. They all want to protect the freedoms of former slaves on some level. And so it's really kind of hard when we look at this and we go, okay, well, what's going on? Why can't they're all on the same side. They all want the same thing. Why can't they agree? And this is why we got to talk about, the ideologies that are at play here. Who are the radical Republicans and who are the moderates? So radical Republicans believe that the South, when they seceded, that they essentially forfeited their rights. Okay, they say, you don't want to be a part of the United States? Okay, great. Well, once they lost the war, they are now conquered provinces. And as such, losers don't get to dictate the terms of the peace, right? And so remember, these are radical Republicans. They believe in abolitionism. They are... they are really some of the extreme on the Republican side. And so they believe that they should dictate the terms for reintegration to these southern states, which is why they cannot agree with what Lincoln wants. So what do radical Republicans want moving forward? They want stiffer terms for these southern states to re-enter the Union. They want to completely uproot the social structure in the South. They want to punish those that took up arms against the Union. And they want the federal government to take responsibility for protecting those freedoms. When it comes to moderate Republicans are middle of the road Republicans, okay? They mostly agree with Lincoln, all right? And they want an easy way to restore the Union. They're not radical. They are Republicans, but they're not radical. So when they look at what the radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens, for example, want, they think that's just too difficult to do. It's too hard to achieve. And so they cannot agree, even though they're on the same side, even though they're in the same political party. They cannot agree on how to move forward with Reconstruction. So when Lincoln is killed, his vice president is going to take over, right? And so his vice president here is Andrew Johnson. Okay, now Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. And, what can I say about him? If you know anything about Andrew Johnson, he is, somebody that grew up relatively poor. This guy was relatively uneducated. He was illiterate, essentially. And he really he had this disdain for those rich plantation owners and aristocrats. And so when Lincoln dies and Johnson takes over for him, radical Republicans look at him and they go, yeah, you know what? Lincoln was so difficult to deal with. Maybe this guy, because he hates these, rich plantation owners as much as we do, maybe he's going to be on our side. Maybe we're actually going to be able to come to an agreement here. And so the reasons why Johnson actually didn't like those rich, plantation owners was because he himself was relatively poor growing up. They looked down on him, because he was poor. And so they thought that they had an ally with him. But unfortunately, though, Johnson was a white supremacist. So he was not, even though he hated these rich plantation owners, he was not about that, emancipation or, having equal rights and protections for former slaves. So what they're going to be faced with is essentially a huge problem, right? If they thought that Lincoln was difficult to deal with, well, Johnson isn't going to be any better, not by a mile. And so when Johnson becomes president, his Reconstruction plan is also known as the 10% Reconstruction plan, but for different reasons, right? So he also wants 10% of the population to essentially vote for reinstatement. But part of his plan is that he gets to appoint these temporary governors, where they have these political conventions where they draw up, new state constitutions. And one of the things about it too, this is where it gets problematic, is that he is going to grant many pardons, many presidential pardons. And so as president of the United States, you probably already know this, but that is one of the sort of rights or not responsibilities, but one of the privileges as president is that you can pardon people. And so he does that, and he grants many pardons to those elites, to those people that the radicals, Republicans believe that should be in prison, that they should be tried for treason. And so the major consequence of Johnson's plan is that this right here allows those elites to return to government. So the war is over. The states are being, brought back. They're being reinstated. But instead of having those people that picked up arms against the U.S. government and that were intense segregationists, they are going to, or in slave owners, racists, right? They are going to be able to come back to power because of Johnson's pardons, right? So he hated these people, but, he wasn't about that emancipation life. And so what this is going to trigger is essentially a battle for control of Reconstruction between the president, right, Johnson, and Congress. Now, Congress at the time is essentially controlled by Republicans. Why? Well, because all the Democrats are where? They're in the southern states that seceded, okay? So they're not even a part of the conversation here. They're going to be told what to do, right? What they have to do to be reinstated. And so Johnson is going to try to take control of Reconstruction, but this is where Congress is going to step in, okay? As you can imagine, right, radical Republicans are infuriated by Johnson. And so if we look at what happens in 1866, Congress passes an amendment, right, for an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, and Johnson vetoes it. Okay, so he can do that. That's his right. But is there anything that Congress can do to override a presidential veto? Well, yes. The answer is yes, but it's not easy to do because they need 2/3 majority to override a presidential veto. And in this case, remember, it's mostly Republicans. And they're trying to take control of Reconstruction anyways, away from Johnson because they don't like his plan. So what happens? Well, they try to pass an extension for a bill to continue funding the Freedmen's Bureau. Johnson vetoes. Congress then strikes back with the Civil Rights Bill, right? So not only are they overriding his veto, but now they're saying, nope, we're going to take it a step, how can I explain this? We're going to take it a step further and pass the Civil Rights Bill. If we couldn't get the Freedmen's Bureau, an extension for the Freedmen's Bureau, then guess what? We are going to put together a bill to guarantee these rights for former slaves. What do you think Johnson does? He vetoes that bill too. Well, they're going to override that veto as well. And so the Civil Rights Bill is known as the 14th Amendment, okay? The 14th Amendment is passed in 1866 after defeating a presidential veto and gets ratified in 1868. So Congress has the votes. They override the presidential veto, right? They couldn't do it on an extension for the Freedmen's Bureau, but they do it with the Civil Rights Bill. And so they prepare it for constitutional amendment. It goes to the states have to vote on it. And when 2/3 of the states approve it, that's when it becomes the law of the land. It becomes ratified. And so the year is in 1868 when that officially happens. Now, this pretty much describes the relationship between the president and the Republican Congress for the rest of his term. They really do not like him, and he doesn't like them either. And this is one of those times where it's pretty interesting how Congress, it's supposed to be that our government is divided equally among these three branches, right? Where not one branch is more powerful than the other two. But legally, Congress is the most powerful one. However, it was designed that way because it's incredibly difficult to get so many, senators and congressmen to agree on anything. As we know, right? We're living this today. We have a very, very divided government, very partisan government. But this is one of those times where they knew what they were doing. And they did it because they thought that this was in the best interest of the nation moving forward. They didn't like Johnson's plan for Reconstruction to reinstate these states. And they went ahead and they overrode those vetoes again and again and again, essentially stripping any kind of power away from the president. There was really nothing he could do. Congress can override a veto, but there's nothing the president can do to, about that. So, what does the 14th Amendment do? Well, several things. It confers civil rights as citizens, okay? So these former slaves are now citizens, but they don't get to vote, right? So it's minus the franchise. Whenever you see franchise, it means to vote, the right to vote. And it basically disqualified federal and state office from federal and state, any former Confederates. So they couldn't serve as governors or anything like that if they had once, sworn allegiance to the Confederacy. And so radicals were pretty disappointed that the 14th Amendment did not grant them the right to vote, right, which is part of their plan, is that they want former slaves to have all the rights, all the protections as U.S. citizens, but it didn't go that far. And the reason why is because they thought if they put that in there now, chances are that this amendment won't pass. It's going to be too much. So what we're seeing here are like baby steps, okay? So we'll get to voting later on. 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship, right? So now, former slaves or not, they are now citizens of the United States. So this takes us to the Reconstruction Act of 1867. And what this essentially happened here is with the passing of the 14th Amendment, you have race riots that are erupting all over the South, several cities throughout the South. And so Republicans in Congress are essentially going to pass the Reconstruction Act to use federal troops to enforce, the rule of law, essentially. And so what's happening here is we have the southern states, those that had seceded, are going to be divided into 5 military districts. They are going to be led by Union generals, and they are going to be policed by blue uniformed soldiers. So we're talking about an estimated 20,000 Union troops. Here we have military district number 1, that is Virginia. North and South Carolina are district 2. Atlanta, Georgia, Florida are district 3. Arkansas and Mississippi are 4. And Texas and Louisiana are 5. So what we see here is essentially they're taking away the southern states' ability to govern themselves. What we're talking about here is a government occupation, right? They have passed the 14th Amendment, And they want the states to own up to that. They want the states to follow suit. And so they are this is about forcing the states to take responsibility for protecting the rights of former slaves. Now, they don't want to do that. But if they want to be reinstated, they have to pass the 14th Amendment. And so if you look at these states right here, right, the date that they are readmitted into the country is the day that they essentially passed the 14th Amendment. So if you look closely, because that's one of the sort of requirements. In order for them to be restored, they have to write a new state constitution where they essentially pledge allegiance to the U.S. Constitution. They accept that, slavery is no more. Furthermore, they are recognizing the passing of the 14th Amendment. And so these are things that they have to do in order to be reinstated. And if they don't do it, those Union troops are going to stay there until they do. And so think about that for a second, right? These troops, in blue uniforms who they've fought against already for 4 years, now they're there, they're occupying their states, and they're forcing them to essentially take responsibility for Reconstruction. They're forcing them to recognize these rights, these protections for former slaves. One of the interesting bits about this is if you look at Tennessee, right? Tennessee had seceded, right? But why isn't it in a military district? Well, the answer to that riddle is because Tennessee did what they were told to do, right? They passed the 14th Amendment and were restored in 1866. But if you look at Virginia, they don't do that until 1870. North and South Carolina, 1868. 1868 for Florida. 1870 for Georgia. 1868 for Alabama. These states are really dragging their feet, okay? Texas, right? March 30th, 1870. They don't want to do it. And I think Texas was the last one to do so. But there you have it. These Union troops are sent to the southern states to force them to take responsibility for Reconstruction, for protecting the rights of former slaves, and Southerners don't like it. Okay, they're not happy about it at all. But for the Republican Congress, right, the issue here lay with forcing the states to take responsibility, like I said, for protecting the freedom of these newly emancipated peoples. And not that the federal government should be doing that. So writing that purpose, that wave of purpose, Congress is going to prepare the 15th Amendment, and it gets passed in 1869 and finally ratified in 1870. So what does the 15th Amendment do? The 15th Amendment prohibits the denial of the vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what does that mean? That means that the 14th Amendment gave them rights as citizens, but it didn't give them the right to vote. Remember, that would have been too much. They were skeptical that it wouldn't have passed. So with the 15th Amendment, that's when they get voting, okay? If you notice, they didn't say on the basis of sex. So you couldn't deny somebody the right to vote on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But they didn't put in there on the basis of sex. And this is very important as well, because if they had, then this would have meant that women could vote as well, okay? And, although the passage of this amendment was a huge win for abolitionists, advocates of the women's rights movement couldn't help but feel disappointed. Why? Well, because women were primarily the ones fighting for abolitionism. They were the ones fighting for the rights of former slaves. For the women's rights movement, for them, women's suffrage and African American suffrage was one and the same. So when they left out the word sex from this amendment, it was a huge blow for the women's suffrage movement. And women are going to have to wait another 50 more years to see the realization of this dream. Okay, so we'll talk more about the 19th Amendment in the following unit. For now, let's go ahead and talk about the end of Reconstruction. Okay, so again, let's sort of recap what we've discussed so far. They passed the 14th Amendment, right? Citizenship. They passed the 15th Amendment, which is voting, right? And remember, that was ratified in 1870. So from 1870 to 1875, African American men were able to vote, and they were able to, they voted Republican, right? Because Republicans are the ones that got them these rights. They're the ones fighting for them. So as you can imagine, there is a lot of resentment among white Democrats, white Southerners. They don't like it. They don't like it because Republicans are essentially controlling these governments in the South. And so in 1875, they come up with a plan to win back control of their government. Okay, so it's known as the Mississippi Plan. And the Mississippi Plan is a use of violence, suppression, intimidation to instill fear in Black voters and prevent them from voting. Okay, so a very simple way of doing this is essentially like showing up to where the voting is taking place and intimidating African Americans from voting. Now, they can do this by brandishing weapons. They can do this by physically getting into these, confrontations with people, to the point being that, it works. It works really, really well. And again, why do they do this? They do this to regain control of the legislature, to regain control of the governor's office. The plan in Mississippi is very successful, and it is going to be adopted in other states like South Carolina. So make sure you know what the Mississippi Plan is, right? It goes into effect after 5 years of African American voters turning out and voting Republican. Southern Democrats want to take back control. So what do they use? They use violence, they use intimidation, lynching, you name it. Okay. So all of this violence is essentially going to go unchecked. The president by 1875 is Ulysses S. Grant, who really doesn't do anything about it. And the plan works, right? To give you an example of how effective the Mississippi Plan is, in Mississippi, the counties with the largest number of Black voters, okay, prior to this plan taking effect. After the Mississippi Plan, let me tell you how many Black votes were turned in. 12, 7, 4, 2, and 0 votes. So these are the 5 counties that had the most African American voters. And then after the Mississippi Plan, that's how many Black votes they got. So was it effective? Absolutely, 100%. And so it's going to be one of those tactics that they're going to use to intimidate Black voters, to stop them from voting, Republican, and essentially regain control of their, governments under the Democratic flag. Okay, this brings us to the Compromise of 1877. Now, the Compromise of 1877 is essentially an unwritten, informal agreement that is going to settle the election of 1876, the presidential election. Okay, so you have the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat. Essentially, this election is going to end up in a tie. Okay, and when this happens, this goes to the House of Representatives. The Democrats were claiming that Tilden had been cheated. They threatened to arm troops and march to Washington, threatening violence and stuff like that. And so, nothing ever really materializes. But in order to settle this dispute, the Democrats are going to agree that, to recognize Hayes as the president under certain conditions, right? So they decide, let's make an agreement here, right? We'll let the Republicans win the presidency, but we want two things. One, we want the removal of federal troops from all of the former Confederate states. And two, we want a Democrat to be appointed to the president's cabinet. So the reason why they want a Democrat appointed to the president's cabinet is because that's his closest set of advisors, right? And so to have a Democrat in the room, as part of the conversations, it's like having a voice for the South, right? So that was something that they were not willing to negotiate on. And the other part is like, okay, why do they want the troops out of the South? And so here's the thing. The removal of the troops, if you remember the map, right, that we were looking at right now, right? You have all of these troops in the South, right, because of the Military Reconstruction Act, right? They were there to do what? To essentially force the southern states to take control, to protect, to take responsibility for the protection of the former slaves, right? But the Southerners don't want them there. They don't like them. They hate them. And so part of the Compromise of 1877, it's not just that it decides who becomes the president here, right? But it's to get the South, to get rid of all of those Union troops out of there. And so this officially ends Reconstruction, right? When those troops are gone, the Republicans leave as well, right? All of those Redeemer, Democrats come back. They come back to save their, Southern people, and they take back control as well. Remember, they figured out how to intimidate black voters. They've managed to kick out all Republicans from the South. And so they're supposed to be there to... Moving forward, right, we're supposed to rebuild this new society. We're supposed to incorporate former slaves into American society. We're supposed to protect their voting privileges and, equal protection under the law. And that's not what happens. By 1877, a lot of people across the country are still they're looking around like, come on, South, get it together. Like, the war was over in 1865. You still can't, fix what's going on down there. A lot of people lost interest. They're ready to move on to bigger and better things. And by that, of course, I'm talking about industrialization. I'm talking about westward expansion. Right? And what gets the result of this is like, okay, well, did Reconstruction succeed or did it fail? Well, let's look at what Reconstruction is, right? Reconstruction is the literal rebuilding of the South, right? Remember, they were left in ruins, right? Their economies were destroyed. So were they able to rebuild them? Yes. Right? Were they able to rebuild society, right, by incorporating these former slaves? Well, yes, to a point. Were they able to grant these former slaves certain rights and protections under the law? Yes. But how far did it go? And then not only that, remember, there's also the restoring part of the states, right? Were they able to bring back the states? Yes. But part of the problem with Reconstruction is that the process wasn't complete. Essentially, they went back to doing things the way that they used to before the war. They went back to segregation. They went back to they established these Jim Crow laws. They had sharecropping, debt peonage. They had very harsh punishments for African Americans. They paid them less. Right? The subjugation of African Americans continued. They deliberately paid them low wages compared to their white counterparts. Right? They deliberately kept them down. That's what subjugation means. It means to keep somebody down. Right? By forcing them or giving them no other options other than sharecropping. You read the sharecropping document. Right? Would you take that? Did it sound to you like these people were free? Jim Crow laws as well, right? Those black codes, they made sure that African American people in the South were not treated equally, right? By telling them what to do, by having these stiff punishments for them. Essentially, violence and intimidation was another way of subjugating African Americans too. And here's the thing, remember, like, okay, well, if you don't like it, what options do you have, right? Well, you can leave the South. Well, you could, but sharecropping was a system that was developed to keep them there, to keep them impoverished, to keep them from going anywhere, right? That was the whole purpose of black codes too, was to ensure a stable and subservient workforce. Lynching, KKK, all of those things. So when we look at things like the civil rights movements, African American civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s, the reason why that happened is because the process of Reconstruction didn't finish. It took until, the 50s for Black Americans to go, hey, you know what? I mean, we're really sick and tired of this. I want to talk about Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy v. Ferguson is a monumental Supreme Court case that essentially puts into place this separate but equal mentality. Okay. Under this agenda, segregation of blacks and whites became very common, right? As long as each group had equal facilities, right? Same purpose. So we're talking about public restrooms, railroad cars, and theater seats and stuff like that. But everybody knows that these facilities were very rarely equal. I'm talking about, water fountains, restrooms, right? Whites only, and then those for what they called colored only. Now, the railroad cars for white patrons, they would typically be cleaner and more comfortable than the cars for blacks. And in the state laws legalizing this practice were known as Jim Crow laws, right? Which is named after this black character, right? In these old minstrel shows. So the case of Homer v. Plessy, which of course takes place in 1896, which is, think about that. It's a little bit after, quite a few years after the end of the war. So this stuff that we're talking about here is actually like in chapter 18, but I like to lecture in theme. So we're doing all Reconstruction right now. Now, Homer Plessy, right, you see the picture of the man right there. He was 1/8 black, right? He had black ancestry. He could probably pass for white. But he, people knew him and they knew about his ancestry. And the way that Jim Crow laws worked was that it didn't matter if you were white looking or if you passed white. If you were black, if you had one drop of black blood, you were black. And in the case of Homer Plessy, he gets on one of these white only rail cars and he is refused. He's arrested. He's convicted, and he's going to appeal his conviction all the way to the Supreme Court, where he loses. Okay? So he's not able to revert that conviction. However, all right, in this Plessy v. Ferguson case, the Supreme Court rules against him based on the justification that Plessy's rights had not been infringed upon because he had been provided with a separate but equal cart. And so that phrase right there, separate but equal, is what is going to give the green light to these laws, these Jim Crow laws, segregationist laws. The violence is going to increase as a result of it. We're going to see lynchings as well. But it doesn't end there, because the disenfranchisement So taking away their voting rights through poll taxes and literacy tests is just another way that the subjugation of African Americans is going to continue. And like I said, it's because the process of integrating millions of former slaves into American life is not fully completed that the civil rights movement takes place, and why we still see, a lot of racial tensions in the United States, even today. So keep those things in mind. We're going to end it here for now. Be on the lookout for the next lecture. Let me know if you guys have any questions on anything. Have a great day, you guys. Bye. Ben.